Thanks very much, TJ. What are the odds you'd get 2 Australians on the stage in the morning? Probably not that high, but happy to be here. And I think part of the reason that it's exciting to be here is that after working in telecom now for 28 years and 5 years most recently with Telia, one of the leading telcos in the Nordics, it's great to have a perspective that really bridges between the vendor side, the operator side, and now, of course, the ecosystem side at ENEA. And I guess many of us only a few weeks ago were in Barcelona. I mean, how many of you were there? Yeah, quite a few. And there were lots of headlines coming out of Barcelona, but I think one that's been discussed quite a lot in the last couple of weeks is whether, in fact, the IT and the telco industries have actually reached convergence. And I guess the announcements of the API initiative from the GSMA was one of those sort of final nudges alongside that networks are now largely programmable and much more IT-oriented than old-school telco-oriented. So you might be forgiven for thinking that that convergence has actually happened and it will be smooth ride from now on. But it's not really the case because we are still, as previous speakers have pointed out, sitting in an interesting dichotomy where the telco industry, despite being privatised quite some years ago, has a history of coming out of government-owned infrastructure and a heritage of 5 nines reliability. Whereas the tech side of things, move fast, break things, Control-Alt-Delete. I mean, the expectations, have come from completely different directions. And despite that, telecom should now be more innovative, service-oriented, application-driven, we still keep getting dragged back to these, extremely high expectations. And part of that may be that many operators still have some sort of government ownership, but certainly a big part of it is that, that telco is subject to more regulation. And they're easier to catch because typically nationally oriented, physical presence, call centres, retail stores. It's easy to hold us to account. And the IT side, of course, typically global, over the top, a bit harder to pin down, and expectations just honestly aren't as high. So we do find ourselves in this contradiction of trust, whereas on one hand, as Dario pointed out, we have the privilege of being in industries which are considered to be extremely trustworthy. Edelman's latest trust index that was just released showed that the tech industry actually enjoys the highest trust of any industry when it comes to will they do the right thing. And telecom is not that far behind at 8th position. Social media, of course, is in the red zone of only 44% satisfaction. But ironically, at the same time as our industries are largely trusted, we're also some of the most hated industries, even here in the US. I mean, the top 3 positions of most hated industries are held by cable operators, wireless providers, etc. And even within our own industry, our chief security officers are saying that we don't put enough attention on security in our strategic planning. So it's not something we can take for granted. We must really do better. But the good news, perhaps, is that we've been here before. This is not our first rodeo. Premium SMS, a situation where we had a fantastic revenue stream. It was driving innovation like nothing else. But now in recent years, we've seen that telecom operators are not prepared to deal with the heartache and the pain of refunds, litigation, dropping customer satisfaction, and are increasingly walking away from this as a channel that they will support at all. Lesson number 2, direct carrier billing. A situation where a better technical solution than premium SMS, more flexible, more robust, but beset with many of the same issues. We see inquiries in multiple parts of the world looking into issues, again, around fraud, bad actors, weak or incomplete consents, and it's really putting the industry under quite a lot of pressure. The good news is, of course, that we step up, and there's a lot of self-regulatory initiatives that are taking place to make sure that we really do clean this up and protect DCB as a fantastic revenue stream for us and something that supports the flourishing ecosystem. And I'm aware that IMF, of course, is heavily involved in this activity. And on the telco side, this was something we worked with a lot with other operators as well. And then we find ourselves in our current challenge of ATP messaging, and I know this is discussed a lot here today. And we can be comforted, in some respects when we see that SMSs are still a very effective form of communication. We know that they are heavily read more than many other channels, but being read is not the same as being effective. And I would argue that perhaps the incredible high rates of fraud and smishing that we're talking about here is meaning that we might fool ourselves if we think that a 90% read rate is good enough. And it's not just the brands that are holding us to account. I mean, whatever you think of Elon Musk, he wasn't wrong recently when he came out and really held the industry to account for inflation of traffic that was costing Twitter many millions of dollars. Equally, other brands are having to spend a lot of time and effort that they would rather spend on promoting their business and services, actually educating their end consumers. As a CMO, the last thing I want to be doing is spending my precious time and money and giving up valuable real estate on my website or other channels to warning my consumers about risks of fraud if they were to use my services. But this is in fact what many banks are having to do, delivery companies are having to do, and telcos are having to do as well. But in Sweden, a couple of things are happening that are a little bit interesting, perhaps. And it's the brands are not just depending on warning consumers and putting pressure back on the service providers. They also have a pretty good plan B underway as well. And this is an example of my own shopping behaviour, and it's not unusual at all in Sweden. So on a website, in this case, let's buy a cool little Danish toy monkey. But in Sweden, you actually get to choose your delivery company. Rather than just having a click and everything else happens behind the scenes, it's a very educated consumer market. And you actually establish trust with some delivery companies more than others. So you actually get to choose your delivery company straight away. You also get to choose your preferred payment provider. And this typically is not your bank. And this is Klarna. It can be other online banking services, and it can be P2P payment as well. So you've done this, you're much more active in the process, and then it gets interesting because then of course you get a delivery notification, and it does come by SMS. And you don't need to read Swedish to understand that there is no link in this SMS. And then you also get an email as well, and both of these are just nudging you to say, open the app, basically. The last time, I had to go searching, the last time I got a delivery notification that included a link was back in December. And then I had to scroll quite a few months to find another one where any SMSs that I was getting in Sweden contained a link. And so once, of course, the delivery is getting closer, I mean, you can get more SMSs. Again, there'll be no links, but by now we're very well trained. We just go to the app, and all the communication from then on is happening in the app, and there's no role for SMS anymore. So there's different ways, I guess, brands and others will seek to instill trust, but also to circumvent those channels that they feel are a problem. So I guess my message to us here today is we've been here before. We know we can do it. We didn't perhaps win the premium SMS battle, but I think we've done pretty well on DCB. I think we have all the possibilities to get it right with A2P. But if you listen to what was happening in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago, the next frontier for us is going to be the APIs. And in this room, I know there's a lot of experience working with APIs, and it's enabled the ecosystem to flourish. But I would suspect that when all the telecom operators start to open up standardised APIs, that the lens of attention on these practices will be much, much stronger. Because again, now we have an industry that is under more scrutiny, more sensitive and perhaps conservative and nervous, entering into a market that has not been quite so regulated before. So I really urge us all, I guess, to first of all clean up A2P, but then look extremely proactively on the emerging API space and make sure that we establish that as an ecosystem that will survive for the next decade. Thank you. And I'll pass now over to my colleague Simeon.
Thanks, Stephanie. So Stephanie's talked about some of the broad trends that we've been seeing. I'm going to look a little bit more in detail. So today we are delivering protection for about a quarter of the world. We are doing billions and billions of events every single day. Stephanie put up a slide showing some examples. You've probably been to many, many presentations where people have put up examples. I'm afraid I'm going to be a little bit crueler. I'm actually going to put you on the spot. Right. With apologies to who wants to be a millionaire. The environment here is, you're there, you're on the stage, you've got a big money prize, you've got to make a decision. The reality is that's just like a consumer. When you get that message coming in, your heart starts pounding. It's like, has my account been compromised? Am I being defrauded? I've got to make an action. Unlike Sweden, there are links on these messages. So I'm going to ask you to vote. By the way, you can't abstain. You've got to hold your hand up to one of these. I'm going to ask you to vote which of these messages is good, that you're going to click on, you're going to follow, you're going to action, and which of these messages is bad and you're going to report as being abusive, being spam. So can I get a show of hands for the message on the left? Who thinks this is the good message? Got a few people. Okay, right, I'm going to try and count that. Right, let's get a view of messages on the right. Who thinks that's a bad message? Oh, yeah. Couple of folks. Okay, so this here, in fact, actually, you are slightly different to the way that when this actually went out, most people thought the message on the right was a good one. If we actually look at it, it's got a link in there that's got a recognizable name. It is a URL shortener, but it does say Bank of A. And people on the left thought, actually, yeah, that's probably not the good one. The reality, you've done well. There's a future for you in security. The good message is the one on the left. The bad message is the one on the right. But the numbers on this chart say this is what people actually reported. They reported the good message, the clean, legitimate message, to a certain extent, far more than the bad message. Now, I somewhat tricked you with this example. These aren't just two theoretical examples or one that I cloned. One of these messages was an actual attack against Californian Employment Directive. The other message was a message sent by a security company designed to protect people if there was suspicious activity on their account. So both of these messages were sent to users. One was an attack, the other was a security message. What you can see is that consumers are so confused by what's good and what's bad, they actually complain far more about this legitimate message that's trying to keep them safe than the actual attack itself. So a couple of takeaways from this. We are trying, as an industry, as a group, to keep people safe, but it's so complicated, it's so fast changing. People are so confused, they're seeing so many sources of information. They just don't know what is good versus what is bad. The thing is, though, I was asking you, the audience. This is an example of when we asked the audience before. There's a fair number of familiar faces in there. We can make changes. We can affect how we as an industry are working with the whole ecosystem to help keep people safer. That particular audience is actually the folks that were at the catalyst of the very first discussion about the thing that turned into 10-digit long code, trying to create trust in the ecosystem. We recognized that we had problems. We recognized there were challenges of, well, how do we identify what is an enterprise message versus a consumer message? At the end of the day, it's just a number. how do we know who is behind it? How do we actually know who the brand is to be able to either help them or identify who the bad actors are? There was no chain of accountability, no consistency there. And frankly, there was just no metric. You know, okay, yes, the only control was should something be allowed or should it be stopped? But there was no accountability to say, actually, no, this isn't good behavior, or more importantly, this is good behavior. Let's reward you. Let's give you more throughput. Let's enable you to have better engagements, interactions, conversations with your customers as a result of that good behavior. And this is where the 10DLC ecosystem has come to play with a whole set of processes, tools, infrastructures, relationships. And I feel it's really made huge, huge benefits in addressing this. Certainly ourselves as sort of one of the tools in that chain trying to make decisions, it's been invaluable. It's a source of information that we can utilize to try and help make better decisions, to reduce false positives, to enable more communication, the right communication to get through on time. But this hasn't fully solved the problem. You know, we've seen from the stats that attacks are still on the rise. Trust is still being eroded. You know, we're seeing, again, not only across the US, across the world, you know, there are so many more attacks arising because people are living more of their lives online. They are responding more immediately to this sort of communication. There are so many more new techniques. I mean, it's a continual changing environment of how people are conducting these sorts of attacks. And it can happen so quickly. I mean, I stood up in a MEF session just literally 6 months ago. I ran through my top 5 views of what we see as being impacts. So that was actually doing an assessment of not only volume, but also effectively economic impact. And at number 5, we had artificial inflation of traffic. I'd now put that at either number 2 or even number 1, just 6 months later. In part, we've seen a growth. I think in part as an industry, we're becoming more aware of the economic impact. I would really strongly advise to have a look at the presentation that Nick Lane of Mobile Squared did at the MEF event in Barcelona. Some very, very compelling stats there about the economic impact of AIT on us as an industry. There about 5% potentially of revenues being affected on that. But when you're talking a multi-billion dollar ecosystem, we're actually talking about somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion there. You know, there's a lot of money in there. The trouble is this is starting to erode trust from the source of the revenue in that ecosystem. It's affecting the brands here. And you can see that there's a small chart of the world on the left-hand side here. When we were measuring this 6 months ago, it was fairly limited to a few countries in your typical sort of high-risk destinations. Chart on the bottom, that was yesterday. 43 active countries, North America, South America, right across Europe, Latin America, South Africa, and Asia. It is a global issue. So, you know, it's a big number, between $500 million to $1 billion. So, you know, who's getting affected? I say it's a big number. You've got to be thinking it's the big brands that are suffering here, right? You know, it's a global problem, so it must be sort of the global players. You know, that's the logical folks you would think are getting affected. And absolutely, when we look at recent attacks, most definitely we are seeing global organizations getting affected. I mean, interestingly, the first example here, this is somebody who operates in this industry with absolute knowledge of the effects and the impacts, and they have the intelligence in-house to address it, yet they still fell victim. It's also not just telcos, it's the enterprises. Any business that has a communication with their customers can fall victim to these same engagements. And it's big organizations. I mean, companies with over 30,000 developers. Again, companies with the skills and the knowledge in-house to be able to do it. But it's also sort of moderate-sized companies. I mean, unicorns, we're seeing these sort of size companies. Not just them, high street retailers are getting affected. Their services, their brand is being abused in artificial inflation of traffic. And in fact, we are still seeing now even things like niche product companies. Anybody that is using messaging as a communication channel that hasn't fully secured how they enable their service to their customer, they're being exploited. It's not just the obvious targets. It's affecting everyone. We are seeing small companies having their entire annual budget blown out of the water by a single attack. So this is where really we have a responsibility as an industry to start helping deliver this type of protection. We need to protect the consumers against the frauds that we saw at the start. We need to protect our customers, the enterprises, against these abuses. It's not just the big customers, it's every single person is at risk here. And frankly, if we don't do this, we're going to lose. I mean, as we saw from Stephanie, people aren't opening messages as much. They're flashing and looking at the top alert, but they're not actually opening them. They're not now clicking on links. It's interesting to see that erosion of links means we're not got the potential for the conversational messages that we are all banking on. People are migrating to alternative services. The SMS becomes the notification, but I go to my app to check the delivery status rather than using the messaging there. So these things, as we saw from Nick Lane, these have a direct financial impact to our business. So we have to address this type of thing. So, as we've seen before with 10-digit long code, the group of us in the room, we can make these changes. So, we are accountable. Let's get going on this. Let's address it. Let's improve what we're doing. Let's talk about it. Let's share intelligence. Let's share techniques, because I can tell you this, the attackers are doing it. We have to be better than them. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for Stephanie. After that call to action, I want to make it a little bit personal and relax a little bit. What would you share, Stephanie, with this audience that is not on your LinkedIn profile?
My LinkedIn profile is heavily edited. I've been in the industry for so long. But I did actually live in the US for 2 years. I was here in 2000 to 2002, working in Silicon Valley, and my job at that time was to convince the emerging tech industry to have a mobile strategy, which is kind of laughable when you look back. It was fun at the time.
How about you, Simeon? Everyone in the room probably knows you, but still.
Well, I think the one thing we never really get on LinkedIn, we know what the career is, but we never really know why. And I always feel that, okay, why did you do that job? What was it? I've got to say, I got into telecoms, back in 1990, because I figured one end was in the UK, the other end wasn't. I wanted to go where that end was. And I think I managed to do a fair bit of traveling as a result. But yeah, you really want to know what makes people tick.
Wanderlust is a very good motivator in life, yes. Stephanie, in your past, you've actually been on the other side, working at an operator. I've always maintained that network management is a thankless job because a good day is when no one yells at you. Having said that, you probably have a more business-focused, story to share about how spam can become a problem for an operator as well.
Yeah, that's true. When I was head of communications at Telia, there's always a lot of crisis going on in the telecom world. But some of the hardest ones to handle actually was when it was messaging spam and frauds and viruses and things like that. And of course, the public face we put out was very calm, but behind the scenes, I think my whole PR team was completely absorbed in trying to manage the risk. The legal teams were completely absorbed. Customer care was all pulled off their jobs to be retrained on how to support consumers. And the marketing team got diverted onto how to educate consumers as well. And when we took a decision at one stage to block some of these messages for the first time, then we had to put spokespeople on breakfast television explaining, that in fact we weren't reading all your SMSs, but we were able to find certain ones that were problematic and block them. And it doesn't go away. I was looking at the news reports last night, and I think Telia is still blocking 2 to 5 million, every month. And that's in a small, 20 million population.
That's almost 10% of.
Yeah.
And that's huge, and that's an important perspective because going back to the operator's challenge, there is no good way out of this in terms of because you're getting blamed for everything from all sides.
Yeah.
Switching gears a little bit about the Telco API initiative, are you bullish about the industry's ability to coalesce around a common APIs?
Bullish, interesting word. I think it's a really important initiative. I think the industry, and my impression from Barcelona too, was that the vendor side, the telco side, are putting a huge amount of faith that open APIs is going to be the new path to monetization for 5G. We'd be kidding ourselves if we felt that the telco sector per se has always managed to grasp that innovation and monetize it. I think as an industry we've failed a few times. So I think it's important. I think they're trying really, really hard. I think they lack a lot of the interfaces to be able to effectively reach a broad developer community, and often it can be challenging on the telco side to work closely enough on strategic initiatives with your customers. It's a big difference selling broadband buckets or fixed links to actually, advising an enterprise on how they would take advantage of network-based APIs. So I'm hopeful it'll be successful, but I do think there's an important role for the people in this room who probably have more experience and are a bit more close with the developer community to actually create those applications.
And what would be what would be the step one for those who were not in Barcelona in terms of?
Yeah, I mean, the GSMA has published, I think, the first 8 defined APIs, and that's a good step. At least they're standardised. How they get interpreted in each country and in terms of who you're allowed to open them up to, etc., I think will be quite interesting. But the first step, of course, is to understand the APIs that are being opened up and to start to talk to the telcos that are signing on to that initiative, which is very, very many of them. And then if I were in this room, I'd be knocking on the door of the telcos and saying, how can I team up with you and help you into these new revenue streams?
Great, that's a good point. Now, my question for next one is for actually Simeon. We just had Tom Johnson talk about the U.S. role in regulators. Thoughts on how the rest of the world is approaching regulation for messaging perspective, especially from a perspective of trust and identity, and the fact that 50%, as Dario, almost universally 50% of people don't trust the medium itself, which is a problem.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, from what we're seeing, there seems to be less emphasis on, let's say, particular mandates of technology, other than certain regions, let's say like India and blockchain. But certainly one of the major common themes that we've seen has been far more around the customer's consumption and interaction of services. So we're seeing quite a bit of regulation saying, well, what's appropriate contact for appropriate times of service? So start thinking about, does a user want to be disturbed by a promotional message outside of hours? Because, there's a huge enthusiasm for adopting this new channel. So let's try and push as much engagement as we can. So, there the regulator seems to have sort of taken more of a view of giving guidelines and best practice on how brands should really engage with users rather than, let's say, the technology of trying to address the fraud and abuse. But it's started to lead to some interesting discussions as well on things like consent management that, again, I think could be an interesting level of discussion to come back. Again, I mean, as we heard from Thomas, sort of talking about some of these ideas of companies that are handling consent on behalf of other companies, that does sound like a bit of a slippery slope.
Mm-hmm. The second part of that same question, which is, what are we doing in the U.S. markets, like Stir Shake Shaken or 10DLC, that the other markets are looking at and saying, oh, that sounds like a great idea?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, the characteristic of the U.S. market is it's great. It's a decent size. You've got a certain number of operators. We're able to get pretty much most of us in a room together, to have these discussions. So I think, when we look at things like campaign registration, that's a great example. People have been talking about that for probably 15 years now, but we've actually made it happen. That's pretty damn good. And, it sounds quite simple, but actually it does mean that we've got an ability to, right the way throughout the chain, understand who is trying to communicate what to whom. And now let's have that full cycle. So if the end user doesn't want it, there is a complete feedback loop to manage it. So I think that as a template is actually something that most definitely will replicate around the world. We've proven it will work here. But also I think, given that I think again, most of us in this room, our customer base are actually so much more than outside the US. Now that we've built the systems and processes to work, extending it to other countries, that's more of a scaling issue.
That's a great point. I think we have time for questions, but before we open up for questions. Ask of this room, Stephanie. I know you took a long flight to get here, so this is your chance to tell us what we should be focused on.
Oh gosh, it's a bit presumptuous that I should tell people what to focus on. But I do think it's super valuable that we have such an international sharing between the different markets. But what I certainly would encourage, though, if I think about the next step beyond cleaning up the ATP environment, is what lessons can we bring from this community in our experience with APIs to preemptively educate and guide telecom operators as many of them are brand new on this journey. I think that's a big responsibility that this room can play a very important role in.
Sameer?
Yeah, I would say, so often we focus on what are the problems and don't quite often reflect upon the successes to be able to articulate them. We're always talking about how many attacks were there, how many bad things did we stop, but actually, the fact that we are enabling so much of an effective conversation, we are enabling so many services. I think being able to find a mechanism to articulate the value of that, to be able to share that and take that out to the rest of the world is something that can be done there.
Great, thank you. With that, we have questions. We have 2 mics and questions.
Good morning. I'm Ryan Tollison with TELUS. And I wasn't at Barcelona, unfortunately. And one of the questions that I have is, there's been open APIs defined by the TMN Forum for quite some time. Do you have experience in applying security on those? And they haven't really been, at least in North America, I don't think widely adopted. So how will the GSMA open API be different? And because I do think we do have a challenge as a telco industry in speaking developer, and that's what we're being asked to do.
Yeah, and I think I have the same sort of question actually, because I worked with developer programs myself 20 years ago, and since then, and I do see that there's a bit of a knowledge and experience gap in the sector. So I'm like you, I'm very curious to see how exactly this is going to be implemented. I think the fact that they're relying on 8 fairly standard APIs to start with is a good first step. But if you look at that, I mean, one of those is, of course, a location pool. And thinking about, and you're in TELUS, I mean, my experience in Telia as well was that, over-the-top app companies can do whatever they like with location half the time. The minute a telecom operator starts to work with a subscriber's location, it's extremely sensitive. So I'm hoping that this will then become quite a discussion, not just in the GSMA, but also in ETNO and some of the other groups, to put some frames around, who can we expose it to, what are the governance processes, what risk assessments do you need to take, et cetera, so that we step into it carefully.
And just from the security side, I mean, again, location sharing is a really interesting one where it almost took the commercialization for the discussions to really catalyze. I mean, we've been seeing on the security side really an increasing awareness of exactly how many people were interrogating networks without their visibility or control for not only location, but a whole range of other additional services. So yeah, I think so it's almost the commercialization starts to formalize people's awareness of actually how are these networks all talking with each other.
Do we have time for one more question?
Hi, this is Moons from Newstar. Links in A2P messages, they can potentially have the most damaging effect, right? Spyware, malware, whatever it is. So from a marketing perspective, this question is mostly for Stephanie. From a marketing perspective, you talk with a lot of brands, right? And I'm sure they want to keep those links in the message, but how comfortable is it, do you think, from your perspective and their perspective, to eliminate links completely and improve trust in those messages?
I mean, of course, life would be easier if you can continue to use the SMSs with links. I mean, it's a more certain delivery than depending on consumers to have notifications, allowed, or assuming that people will download an app. It's a much bigger barrier, of course, to get people to download that app. So I think from a marketing point of view, I would rather that we were able to make the the use of links transparent, easy for people to understand, whether a message can be trusted or not. But until we get to that point where people can feel confident, then you have to have a plan B. You have to educate people to download your app. And then, of course, once you get in that situation where people are becoming app-centric, then, of course, you can build a whole lot of richness in that as well. So, as an industry, I think we need to fix the SMS pretty quickly. Otherwise, the alternate path is already being carved. And it's not a bad one, actually, from a marketing point of view. Once your app is on the phone, it's quite sticky. And people are unlikely to download. Like in my case, I download 1 or maximum 2 delivery company apps, so the other 5 don't get a look in. Same with payments. So, yeah, so then it becomes a lot stickier.
Well, thank you so much for our panel. Thank you.